Hello there. Tonight we are going to step back in time, not to a dusty battlefield or the echoing halls of an empire, but to something far more delicate, more personal, and surprisingly more suffocating: a Victorian wedding. Not one you've seen in movies with sweeping strings and flower petals raining down. No, this one smells faintly of beeswax, lavender, and nerves hidden under 20 layers of silk. Picture it, you're standing outside a small parish church in the English countryside. The air is cool and damp in that fresh after rain kind of way, and there's a light fog curling along the grass like even the weather is whispering. A few distant bells chime softly, not dramatically, but just enough to make you pause. You can hear the heavy breathing of horses tethered nearby, the low murmur of guests arriving on foot, and the rustle of petticoats over gravel. You smell the flowers first, sweet sharp orange blossoms and sprigs of myrtle in little nosegays, and then something else. Starch. Layers and layers of starched linen pressed into shape to create silhouettes that defy human anatomy. It's beautiful. Yes. But also quietly terrifying, because make no mistake, if you suddenly woke up as the bride in this scene, there's a good chance you wouldn't survive long enough to say I do. Between the corsetry, the social rules, the weight of generational expectations, and the absolute impossibility of peeing discreetly, you'd be done for before the second hymn. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you're still awake, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your little corner of the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. It's early. Not sunrise early, but that solemn kind of morning when the world is awake but hasn't fully spoken yet. Birds flit through the hedges and the grass glistens under a shy dew. You are standing just outside the church gate watching guests arrive. No one is rushing. No one is laughing loudly. It's all very measured. A woman walks past you, clutching her bonnet as the breeze tries to lift it. She's wearing her Sunday best, probably borrowed, definitely pressed, and her boots make a soft, deliberate thud with every step. The man beside her doffs his hat, revealing hair slicked flat with what might be Victorian pomade or possibly goose fat. It's hard to tell. Either way, it glistens. They join a growing group outside the church doors, exchanging restrained nods and murmurs. No selfies, no pre-wedding cocktails, no wedding planners in headsets whispering about the flower wall. Just guests, arriving and waiting. You glance up at the church. It's old. Really old. The kind of old that makes your knees feel young. Its walls are rough stone with ivy clinging like memory. The windows glint in the shifting, light-colored glass tucked into frames that don't quite sit straight anymore. You can almost feel the quiet weight of thousands of ceremonies held here before. Christenings, funerals, harvest blessings, and now this. Historians still debate whether parish weddings were truly spiritual choices or simply the only option available. But to the Victorians, even the ordinary held gravity. And the church, that was the anchor. You didn't just get married in a building, you were married into a rhythm, a tradition, a structure that had existed before you and would endure long after. A breeze sweeps past, stirring the flower garlands hung above the doors. Myrtle, roses, sprigs of rosemary, all arranged with almost suspicious precision, because every bloom carries meaning. This is the language of flowers, and Victorians spoke it fluently. A lily doesn't just smell nice, it means purity. Ivy clings because it symbolizes fidelity. And myrtle. That's a direct shout-out to Queen Victoria herself, who adored it so much it became basically mandatory for brides. There's a hush, now soft and expectant. Even the birds seem to pause. The bells chime again, closer, fuller this time, and the door creaks open. Guests begin to trickle inside their footsteps, muffled by worn stone. The air shifts the moment you cross the threshold. It's dark inside, but not gloomy. There's a hush here too, but it's heavy with reverence. The scent is immediate wood polish, melting wax, and something floral and old. Maybe someone spilled lavender oil years ago and it just stayed. Sunlight filters through stained glass, casting wobbly rainbows onto the flagstone floor. You watch a child try to catch them in her palm, her gloves making tiny squeaks as she reaches. The pews are simple, unadorned wood, not designed for comfort, but for structure. Everyone files in according to plan. There's no spontaneous sitting wherever you want. Victorians loved hierarchy almost as much as they loved baked meats. The families take their places. There's some shuffling, a cough, then silence. The organ begins to warm up, slow, thoughtful notes vibrating through the stone. And just outside, at the edge of vision, something stirs. The bride is coming. There's a ripple through the room like a collective breath held. No phones rise into the air. No one turns to snap a picture. Just eyes, hundreds of them turning slowly toward the door. The story is about to begin. The church seems to hold its breath, and so do you. As the great wooden doors creak open, a soft gust of outside air wafts in, stirring the petals. Along the aisle, real flower petals. Not biodegradable paper or Instagrammable confetti. They're arranged in a careful scatter down the center of the stone path. White blossoms, pale lavender, the occasional dusty green sprig. It's not just decoration, it's intention. A living path of symbols. A message spelled out in scent and color for those who know how to read it. Because Victorians didn't just like flowers. They practically assigned them PhDs. They created entire dictionaries for the stuff books, where a single bloom might mean innocence in one chapter and betrayal in another, depending on its placement and whether it was handed with the right or left hand. Don't ask how they kept track. They didn't have Netflix or indoor plumbing. They had time. The language of flowers, florography, was everywhere in the Victorian era, but it reached its peak at weddings. Each petal wasn't just pretty. It was a whisper. Myrtle, love, and marriage. Orange blossom, purity and eternal fidelity. Rosemary, remembrance. And lilies. Those were for purity, sure, but also sometimes death, which makes you wonder how many bridesmaids clutched their posies with slight unease. Up near the altar, you spot more blooms. Ivy wrapped around columns, twisting in lazy spirals like nature's handwriting. Daisies tucked into crevices where no sunlight dares to reach. And near the lectern, a tall vase of white roses, timeless, flawless, and definitely not grown locally in midwinter. Someone paid for those, and someone else arranged them with a level of precision that suggests either deep love or dangerous levels of perfectionism. You can almost see her now, the florist hunched over a pew, muttering to herself about asymmetry and petal bruising. Her hands stained green, her fingers full of pinpricks. You'd be forgiven for wondering whether Victorian florists developed carpal tunnel before anyone knew what carpal tunnel was. Meanwhile, the sunlight shifts again. A pale beam falls diagonally across the aisle, catching motes of dust and slices of stained glass color. They fall across the backs of guests' heads like ethereal halos. The room is so quiet now that even the creaking of an old floorboard becomes a minor event. Someone adjusts their bonnet. Another person coughs quietly into a gloved hand. The organ player hesitates on a note and gently resets. The moment stretches. Then a hush deeper than before. The bride appears. She doesn't enter with fanfare. There's no dramatic swell of music, no artificial fog machine. She simply arrives. From the back of the church, arm in arm with her father, or perhaps in his absence a brother or uncle or someone important enough to stand in. In some cases, it was even the family solicitor. Because nothing says romance like your mom's lawyer walking you down the aisle. But today it's her father, tall and grave, clutching her arm like both an escort and a reminder of everything she's leaving behind. He doesn't speak. Neither does she. Words are unnecessary and possibly discouraged. The message is clear. One life ends, another begins. Her dress moves like a whisper. It doesn't sparkle, it doesn't glint. There's no rhinestone waistband, no dramatic slit up the leg. The gown is modest, high neckline, long sleeves, a fabric that looks soft but heavy silk, maybe satin, some shade of white, though in certain lights it's closer to ivory or cream. True, pure white was expensive. Most dresses looked white enough. And lace. Of course there's lace. On the bodice, the hem, the veil. Some of it hand-stitched over months by women with stronger eyesight and greater patience than most of us will ever know. The lace itself may be an heirloom passed down from mother to daughter, stored in camphor-scented trunks protected like treasure. Her veil is long. Not so long that it drags behind her like a bridal comet, but long enough to shroud her face in mystery. It's not see-through like modern veils. It's gauzy and matte and slightly uneven, as if it was never intended to be purely ornamental, because it wasn't. That veil was a symbol, a barrier between the maiden and the world, a final modest shield before she is given away quite literally to her new life. You might find yourself wondering how she's breathing under there, or walking, or seeing, especially with the corset cinched so tightly beneath all those layers that her waist appears barely wider than a dinner plate. Fashionable, beautiful, and absolutely suffocating. Victorian corsetry was no joke. For brides, the pressure to achieve the perfect silhouette, the wasp waist. The gentle slope of the shoulder meant tight lacing until ribs ached and organs politely shuffled aside to make room. If you think Spanx are uncomfortable, imagine being sewn into your own skeleton support system, unable to sit without leaning like a porcelain doll. Historians still debate whether tight lacing actually caused permanent damage or whether it was just a form of social hazing no one wanted to quit first. But there's no doubt it was difficult. Brides often fainted, not from emotion, just from breathing too little. As she approaches the altar, the congregation subtly leans forward, not in disrespect, but in reverence, because this is the moment. The very air feels heavy with tradition. The petals on the aisle seem to glow, and if you look closely, you'll see that each person's face reflects something deeper than just admiration. There's nostalgia here, memory, quiet anxiety. Because this wedding, like all weddings, isn't just about two people, it's about the weight of the past, the shape of the future, and the endless machinery of society clicking softly into place. She reaches the front. Her father lifts her veil. There's no dramatic kiss, no cheering, just a subtle nod, a handoff, and then he steps away. Now it's just the couple side by side, not touching, not smiling broadly. Standing still in the ancient hush of the church, surrounded by symbols most guests no longer notice. But you do, because you're still watching. And you realize this isn't just a wedding, it's a performance. Every detail from the placement of the myrtle to the creak of the floorboards is scripted by centuries, a ritual not designed for spectacle but for endurance. Outside, the bells begin to chime again. Not loud, just enough to remind the world that something sacred is happening here. And if you close your eyes, you might feel it, the gentle buzz of connection, of continuity, of two lives about to be woven together like lace on the bride's hem. The stillness is almost too perfect. You can hear the distant echo of the organ softly transitioning into the gentle strains of a familiar tune. The opening bars of Wagner's bridal chorus drift down the aisle, not with the grandiosity of modern renditions, but with a certain restrained beauty. And the bride steady now begins her final approach. Her footsteps are slow, deliberate, not theatrical. Her shoes, likely satin, perhaps dyed to match her gown, make the faintest scuff against the cold stone floor. And with every step, the weight of her gown sways softly behind her, a gentle rustle like parchment turning in a quiet library. This is where the magic and a fair share of discomfort truly begins. Victorian wedding fashion was no casual matter. The bride's dress, as we've seen, wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a manifesto. A white or nearly white gown wasn't always the obvious default. In fact, white wasn't even particularly popular before Queen Victoria wore it for her own wedding in 1840. Before that, brides often wore their best dress, usually a deep color like blue-green, or even brown, something they could re-wear for other formal occasions. Practical, yes. Romantic, not particularly. But Queen Victoria changed that forever. Her white gown sparked a trend that rippled through the empire faster than gossip at a village tea. Suddenly, white became the aspirational color for brides across the social spectrum. It symbolized purity, innocence, and quite conveniently wealth, because wearing something that would stain immediately was a sign that you didn't have to worry about chores. The whiter the fabric, the richer the implication. Still, not every Victorian bride could afford snowy silk or fine lace. Some opted for shades of ivory dove grey or even lilac, soft, demure tones that still spoke of humility and devotion. A woman might choose a dress she could wear, again perhaps dyed later for another occasion. And don't think for a second she only had to think about how it looked. That gown had to send a dozen messages at once. About her modesty, her family's standing, her domestic readiness, and her compliance with the silent social script everyone around her had memorized since birth. The gown was almost always high-necked. You wouldn't find any plunging sweetheart necklines here. Sleeves were long, sometimes puffed at the shoulder, but always tight at the wrist. A modest silhouette was the goal, respectable demure, and above all, covered. Fashion magazines of the day praised dresses that reflected delicacy and virtue, which really just meant don't show any skin. And do not, under any circumstances, look like you enjoy your body. Even the buttons, hundreds of tiny ones, often ran up the back like a delicate spine. Someone had to fasten those for her. A sister, a maid, a very patient mother with good eyesight and steady hands. It probably took half an hour, at least. Maybe more if she kept fidgeting, or if someone insisted on redoing the sash just once more. Modern wedding prep might involve a mimosa and a Bluetooth speaker. The Victorian version, tight lacing, whispered prayers, and someone fainting quietly into a chair. Historians still debate whether these stiff formal gowns were embraced out of genuine aesthetic preference or sheer societal pressure. But one thing is certain, comfort was not on the invitation list. Even the veil, long, opaque, and heavy, was more than symbolic. It was a physical and emotional barrier. Until it was lifted by her father or husband-to-be, the bride was in a kind of social limbo, not quite her father's daughter, not quite a wife. The lifting of the veil was less a romantic gesture and more a ceremonial transfer of ownership, like unveiling a new portrait, or unwrapping the most immobile Christmas present imaginable. If she were of means, her veil might be trimmed in hand-stitched lace, possibly with fine beads sewn in by candlelight. If not, it might be simpler, but still long, still purposeful, and it was expected to be kept for years tucked into a special box or folded into a future daughter's trousseau. It wasn't just fabric, it was history. The bride's hair was likely parted down the center and pinned into an elegant, slightly severe chignon, maybe adorned with a few orange blossoms, real ones, if the family could afford them. Those blossoms were Queen Victoria's favorite, and their sweet, almost citrusy scent had become a near requirement in upper-class weddings. Sometimes they were wax replicas, delicately crafted and arranged into a crown. Fake, but so beautifully fake that no one dared complain, at least not out loud. You notice as she stands beside the groom that even her bouquet is a quiet statement. There are no wild blooms or cascading arrangements. Just a small, tightly arranged clutch of meaningful stems, perhaps myrtle for love, rosemary for memory, and lily of the valley for sweetness. Nothing was random. Each petal meant something. Each bloom was a whisper from a century that believed flowers could say the things propriety would not allow. And what of the groom? He stands beside her, now his own attire equally considered but far less ornate. A black frock coat pressed and precise. Crisp, white shirt, a high collar so starched it could double as a weapon. His necktie is modest, perhaps a simple white bow or a carefully folded cravat, and his shoes polished to a mirror sheen make no sound on the stone floor. He does not wear a ring. Not yet. Not at all, really. In the Victorian era, men typically did not wear wedding rings. Their commitment was expected to be visible in other ways, their social conduct, their work ethic, their role as provider and head of the household. A ring on his finger might have seemed unnecessary, if not vaguely indulgent. It's a strange contrast, isn't it? The bride wrapped in symbols and ornaments, swathed in fabric and layers of expectation, and the groom neat but minimalist, ready to speak his vows with a calm voice and a face that reveals very little. He's expected to be strong, quiet, and stable. Anything more passionate might seem improper. Emotional expression was reserved for poetry and gravesites. Yet, despite the stiffness of posture and the formality of dress, there's something undeniably tender in how they glance at each other. A barely perceptible nod, the soft shift of a gloved hand, a momentary breath held in synchrony. The organ falls silent. The priest clears his throat, and the ceremony begins. They will not speak long. The vows are brief and solemn, to have and to hold for better for worse, spoken in voices that tremble not from nerves but from the sheer weight of what they mean. There are no spontaneous I love yous, no cheeky winks or shared giggles, just the steady unfolding of a tradition older than the stones beneath their feet. Outside, a dove coos softly. Or maybe it's just the wind pressing through a broken window pane. Either way, it feels intentional, as if nature too is watching. And as the final words are spoken and the couple turns unified, now you notice something odd. No one claps, no one cheers. Just the soft collective exhale of a room that knows the real celebration comes later after the signatures, the strict etiquette, and maybe, if all goes well, a slice of brandy-soaked fruitcake you can use as a doorstop for the next 30 years. The priest has finished speaking. The words have been said, the vows exchanged, and the final blessing murmured over the heads of two people who are now officially, legally, and spiritually joined. The silence is complete. No music just yet. No dramatic recessional. Just the rustle of stiff fabrics, the faint creak of wood beneath polished leather shoes, and maybe, just maybe, the quiet intake of breath from someone holding back tears. And then, as if choreographed by some invisible Victorian stage manager, the newly married couple turns slowly to face the congregation. This should be a joyful moment, right? Cue applause, clapping an aunt sobbing into a lace handkerchief. Maybe a little wave from the bride, a wink from the groom. But no, absolutely not. Because this is a Victorian wedding, and Victorian weddings do not tolerate public exuberance. Not yet, anyway. Instead, the couple makes their way down the aisle in a strangely formal silence, walking side by side but not touching. Their expressions are serene to the point of blankness, really. The crowd doesn't cheer. No one whistles. And the bride doesn't look left or right no matter how many cousins she's passing. This is by design. You see, in the Victorian era, it was considered bad form, verging on vulgar for the bride and groom to acknowledge anyone in the congregation during their exit from the church. No eye contact, no gestures, no smiles at Uncle George. The idea was that turning their attention toward individual guests would somehow detract from the sanctity of the vows they had just taken. It was in essence a moment of dignified retreat. As the couple walks, you can feel the tension. The sort of tension that comes not from conflict, but from an overwhelming desire to do everything properly. One wrong glance, one twitch of the lips, and the spell could be broken. It's like watching two statues glide slowly out of a museum. Historians still debate whether this rule of silent departure was truly about reverence or just an incredibly British way of avoiding awkward small talk at high-stakes moments. But etiquette was everything. And the rules didn't stop at silence. For instance, the bride was supposed to walk exactly one step behind the groom to signify deference and transition. He was now the head of their new household, and her very gait acknowledged this. It was a physical expression of social order captured in choreography. And the guests, they were expected to remain still and seated until the couple had completely exited the building. Only then could the rest of the congregation begin to stir like a pond after a pebble has passed through. And once outside, that's when the restraint began to crack just a little. The moment the couple steps out into the daylight, a soft collective sigh seems to escape the gathered guests, as though everyone has been holding their breath. The sun is still low in the sky, filtered through tall trees and hedgerows. Birds chirp politely. The church doors swing open wider. And suddenly whip a handful of rice arcs through the air, narrowly missing the groom's shoulder. Then another, then another. Grains rain down like a hushed celebration, soft little thuds against veils, top hats, and coat sleeves. Some bounce off the cobblestones, some land in hair or down collars or into bonnets where they'll hide until well into the reception. There's laughter now, still restrained but no longer silent. The spell is broken. The serious part is over. The tradition of throwing rice or barley or oats or even birdseed was more than just celebratory. It had deep roots in ancient rituals going back to pagan fertility rites and agricultural symbols of abundance. Grain was life. Grain was future. To shower the couple with it was to wish them prosperity children and a pantry that never ran dry, a tactile blessing in edible form. And it wasn't just symbolic. It was physical. You couldn't leave a Victorian wedding without at least a few grains of something wedged into your boots. Or your bouquet, or your underclothes. Of course, someone would eventually have to sweep it all up. Probably an underpaid sexton or a very annoyed flower girl. As the couple regains their composure under the drizzle of blessings, a new character appears in the scene. A chimney sweep. Yes, you heard that right. From the edge of the crowd, a man emerges covered in soot, with a top hat smudged and crooked. His face is darkened from coal dust, and a grin breaks through the grime. He walks forward boldly, cheerfully, and lifts his hat to the bride. And then with surprising grace, he plants a kiss on her cheek. The guests titter. Some clap. A few gasp, but no one stops him. This, bizarrely enough, is tradition. The lucky chimney sweep was a staple of many Victorian weddings, believed to bring good fortune if he kissed the bride. The origin, likely a mixture of folk tales and royal PR. One popular story goes that King George III was once saved by a chimney sweep who stopped his runaway horses. Grateful, the king declared chimney sweeps bearers of luck and decreed that they should be welcomed at weddings. Whether that's true or not, historians still debate, but the tradition stuck. It's a wonderfully eccentric detail in an otherwise stiff and formal ritual. The image of a soot-covered stranger delivering a chaste peck on the bride's cheek, while her new husband stands politely nearby, is one of those moments where Victorian decorum meets Victorian whimsy. And it's not over yet. With the rice still clinging to their shoulders and the chimney sweep vanishing back into the crowd, the couple turns toward their next destination, the wedding carriage. It waits at the edge of the churchyard, gleaming and garlanded. Often it was a landau or brougham, closed or open depending on weather and wealth, drawn by a pair or even a quartet of white horses. The horses might wear ribbons braided into their manes or small flower garlands draped behind their ears. The coachman sits up, top stoic and straight-backed, dressed in formal livery that probably hasn't changed in decades. This isn't just a ride to the reception. It's a symbolic journey. The couple's first steps into married life together in motion on public display. They don't speak as they climb inside. The bride gathers her skirts. The groom offers a hand. The door closes with a quiet finality. The crowd outside the church parts to make way. There's a final cheer, not raucous, but warm, and the wheels begin to roll. The clop of hooves on cobblestones echoes like a drum roll fading into the countryside. Inside the carriage, it's quiet. Just the two of them now. The first privacy they have had all day. And even then, probably not fully alone. There might be a footman seated discreetly outside, or a younger sibling hitching a ride in the front seat. Victorian privacy came in shades. Still, for a few minutes, there's just the soft creak of the carriage, the shifting light through lace curtains, and the realization that everything, absolutely everything, has changed. She's no longer a daughter. He's no longer a bachelor. They are Mr. and Mrs. now in the fullest, most legally binding sense. The road ahead is long, sometimes bumpy, often very, very public. But for now, they lean back against embroidered cushions, let the sunlight flicker across their faces, and listen to the rhythmic heartbeat of horses carrying them into the rest of their lives. The wedding carriage rolls gently along the country lane, its wheels turning with a deliberate ceremonial grace. The white horses, perfectly groomed and adorned with their flowered harnesses, clop, clop, clop in rhythm, as if even they understand the gravity of the moment. Inside the carriage, the bride and groom sit side by side, not yet touching, still learning what this new closeness feels like. The silence between them isn't awkward. It's expectant. After all, this might be the longest stretch of unchaperoned time they've had together ever. The air inside is perfumed with rose water and laced with hints of starch and soap. The bride adjusts her skirts carefully, still mindful of decorum. The groom clears his throat once then again. He doesn't know whether to speak yet. It's only been 10 minutes since they signed their names in the parish register, and already everything feels heavier. Behind them, the church slowly recedes, a distant silhouette against the sky. The guests begin to spill out, some into carriages, others walking arm in arm headed to the next venue, the wedding breakfast. Now don't let the name fool you. Despite the term, the Victorian wedding breakfast had little to do with fried eggs or morning tea. It was usually held just after midday following a late morning ceremony. The term breakfast here means the first meal of the couple's married life, the breaking of the fast after their spiritual union, a symbolic feast to mark the start of their shared journey. And it was no small affair. If you were lucky enough to be invited, you'd find yourself ushered into a reception held either at the bride's family home, if they were wealthy enough to host such a thing, or perhaps in a rented hall or private room in a fashionable hotel. And when we say fashionable, we're talking about dark wood-paneled rooms, high ceilings, ornate wallpaper, and enough doilies to reupholster an entire drawing room. The tables would be long, white-clothed, and immaculate, every place setting arranged with ruthless precision, the silver polished until it caught the afternoon light like water. Each fork, knife, and spoon had a designated location and purpose. God help you if you picked up the wrong one first. Forks on the left, knives and spoons on the right. Work your way in. And the knife blade always facing toward the plate. Not because of etiquette. Well, yes, because of etiquette. But also because a blade facing outward was seen as aggressive, symbolically hostile. You didn't want to threaten your neighbor before the soup course, now did you? The seating chart was a masterclass in social engineering. The most esteemed guest godparents, titled relatives, influential family friends, were placed closest to the bride and groom. The more distantly related or marginally tolerated were politely shuffled to the far ends of the table. You could tell a lot about a person's standing by how far they had to walk to reach their seat. You're probably wondering what was served. The answer is everything. The meal typically featured multiple courses, beginning with clear soup or consommé, followed by fish, perhaps poached salmon with dill sauce, then roast meats like lamb or beef. There would be game birds if the family had access, and always a selection of seasonal vegetables arranged with geometric care. Asparagus, new potatoes, carrots cut into perfect coins. It was a display of abundance and refinement. Don't forget the sauces, gravy, horseradish, mint jelly. And somewhere in there, maybe nestled between the roast duck and a jellied aspic, would be the savories. Small salty dishes designed to sharpen the appetite, as if that were even necessary after 4 courses. Victorians loved elaborate presentation. Food wasn't just eaten, it was admired, critiqued, whispered about. Swans carved from butter, pudding shaped like castles, jellies that trembled like Victorian social anxiety. Some households hired French chefs to really drive the point home. Look how refined we are. See how many forks we own. Wine would be served but discreetly. Champagne if the family could afford it. Claret, perhaps. But drunkenness, absolutely not. Being visibly inebriated at a wedding was social suicide. A little flushed, acceptable. Singing sea shanties on the table. Not so much. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine preference for sobriety or just another form of performative control designed to keep everyone sitting upright and not dancing on the table with a lampshade on their head. The bride and groom seated at the head of the table wouldn't eat much, partly because of nerves, partly because the bride's corset wouldn't allow it, and partly because everyone was watching, every gesture, every glance, every spoonful of trifle. She might hold her knife delicately as if it were a feather. He might offer her a piece of fruit or lean slightly toward her when speaking. Small things, meaningful things. These were their first moments as a married couple in the eyes of society. And society was watching. There would be toasts. Of course, the father of the bride would likely give the first welcoming the groom into the family and offering praise that was equal parts sincere and strategic. The groom would respond nervously, thanking everyone, possibly mentioning his new wife with words like grace and virtue, because calling her funny or brilliant would be far too casual. Other male relatives might chime in. Brothers, uncles, business partners with slightly too much port in their systems. But the speeches remained within the narrow lines of Victorian propriety. No off-color jokes, no wedding roast. You wouldn't find anyone saying, "Remember that time you streaked through Oxford?" Not unless they wanted to be cut off from the inheritance. And then, just as the room begins to buzz, with polite laughter and the soft clink of cutlery, you'd notice a shifting of attention. Eyes turning, a collective sense of anticipation. Because here it comes. There is wedding cake. It is not as you might expect a sponge with raspberry filling and buttercream. No, this is a fruitcake. Dense, dark, spiked with brandy or cherry liqueur, packed with raisins, currants, chopped nuts, candied peel, and enough symbolism to last a lifetime. It arrives on a wheeled cart or carried by a team of servers and is placed before the couple like a small tiered monument, covered in royal icing thorn, thick and white and hard enough to shatter under pressure. The cake might have 3, 4, even 5 tiers, each layered with additional symbols. The top tier often saved, either for the birth of the couple's first child or for their first anniversary, whichever came first. Yes, really. They'd wrap it up, store it in a tin, and let time do its mysterious, vaguely terrifying work. Hopefully, with no mice involved. The cake might feature eatable figurines, sugar flowers or tiny charms baked inside. Pull the right one and you might find a coin for wealth, a ring for upcoming marriage, or a thimble. Ah yes, the dreaded thimble which meant you'd remain a spinster. Thanks, cake. Cutting the cake was more than ceremonial. It was the first shared task of the married couple, a symbol of unity, partnership, and mutual responsibility. The bride would place her hand atop the groom's, and together they would slice awkwardly through the hardened frosting and into the fruit-laden core. You can imagine the guest leaning forward murmuring, "Will it cut cleanly? Will it wobble? Will someone cry?" It's a strange, beautiful little moment, a mix of joy and pressure, of sugar and scrutiny. The slice is lifted, placed carefully on a small china plate, and offered to the bride first. She may take a bite. She may just smile and dab her lips with a monogram napkin. Either way, the message is clear. The feast has begun. The future is sweet or chewy. Possibly both. And as the rest of the cake is portioned out and served on delicate plates, the clatter of conversation rises. People begin to lean closer, chairs squeak across the floor, and the room starts to feel warmer, softer, a little less rigid. Because while the rules were many, and the courses were tight, and the knives were facing inward, the essence of it all was still there. Celebration, togetherness, and that one hopeful idea the Victorians believed so fiercely in, that love like cake is better when shared. The plates are being cleared, the last crumb of fruitcake quietly surrendered, and the hum of polite conversation wraps around the room like a warm woolen shawl. Guests begin loosening their stiff posture just a bit. Someone allows themselves a full-bodied laugh. A father unclenches his jaw. It's as if the air itself is relaxing. But before anyone dares to leave or unbutton a single glove, one final duty remains: the photographs. Now, if you're imagining the modern routine group shots, on the church steps, candids of flower girls sneaking cake, a professional in skinny jeans telling the groomsmen to act natural, you're in the wrong century. Victorian wedding photography was an event all its own. Still, a relatively new luxury wedding photography became increasingly accessible to the upper middle class in the latter half of the 19th century. Not everyone could afford it, of course, but those who could saw it as a chance to capture what was likely the most important day of their lives on an actual piece of paper. Not a painting, not a sketch, but a real photograph. Modernity, at least by candlelight standards. The camera itself enormous, a wooden box perched on spindly legs draped in black cloth. The photographer, usually dressed like a respectable librarian, would skulk about quietly for most of the reception, then suddenly appear with great urgency and declare it time to pose. The setup process took ages, the exposure times were long, and smiling out of the question. Why will try holding a toothy grin for 5 minutes while standing perfectly still in a corset that doesn't allow full oxygen exchange? You'd look manic, or haunted, or dead. So instead, everyone adopted the classic Victorian expression: somber, serene, and slightly constipated. The bride and groom were photographed first, side by side, never touching too intimately. The bride might hold her bouquet carefully at her waist or fold her gloved hands neatly in her lap. The groom would stand tall, perhaps one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other tucked elegantly into his waistcoat. They looked less like newlyweds and more like business partners announcing the opening of a very formal haberdashery. But there was a certain nobility to it. These weren't moments you snapped casually. They were crafted artifacts, intended to be treasured, passed down, or displayed with pride in a drawing room next to the family Bible and the taxidermy fox. And then came the group photos, the parents, the bridesmaids, the groomsmen, all arranged with military precision. Aunts were summoned from tea, children were wiped clean, hats were adjusted, every detail mattered. Because in this world of smoke, soot, and fleeting joys, a photograph was something that would last. Historians still debate whether these images were meant to capture genuine emotion or simply serve as a visual proof that one had followed all the correct procedures: ceremony complete, dress, worn vows, spoken cake cut. Either way, the result was often striking. There's a quiet dignity to these portraits, even when the bride looks mildly terrified, and the groom appears as if someone has told him he's now responsible for an entire human woman. Eventually, the photographer, having adjusted the final cravat and cleared his throat for the 12th time, would give a subtle nod, lift the lens cap, and capture the scene. Click! And just like that, a sliver of history was made. As the guests begin to disperse again, the atmosphere softens even further. It's time for Gifseln. Now, unlike today's modern gift registries filled with espresso machines, towel sets, and 3 kinds of pasta strainers, Victorian wedding gifts were a bit more foundational. Think of furniture. China sets, silver tea services, quilts, a carved writing desk, perhaps even a full dining room hutch if the giver was particularly generous or guilty. These gifts weren't just tokens of affection, they were critical infrastructure for building a new home. Because newly married couples in the Victorian era rarely started their life together with much of anything. They didn't live together before marriage, they didn't co-own appliances, and there was no such thing as splitting the rent. The bride came from her family home, the groom often from boarding or bachelor lodgings. Together, they were expected to set up an entirely new domestic space from scratch. So the gifts, however lavish or modest, served a real purpose. A tea set wasn't just decorative. It was a tool for hospitality, for social climbing, for keeping up appearances. Every fork, every towel, every porcelain cup bore the unspoken label: this is who we are now. The bride might unwrap these items with quiet delight, her gloved fingers running over the etching on a crystal decanter or the embroidery on new linens. Each one would be carefully recorded in a ledger, the giver noted beside it with an equally precise thank you note to follow in due course. But beyond the dishes and silver, one gift mattered more than all the others combined. The dowry. Ah yes, the financial elephant in the room. The dowry was the sum money property assets that the bride's family contributed to the marriage. It was often negotiated in advance, sometimes years ahead, and recorded in legal documents that made prenups look like friendly suggestions. The idea was simple. The bride brought wealth with her, securing not just her place in her new household, but often influencing which household she ended up in. For wealthy families, a large dowry could seal an alliance, open doors in business, or grant access to a better tier of society. For families of modest means, it might be scraped together painstakingly, bit by bit, just to ensure their daughter wasn't left behind in the social shuffle. The groom's family in turn might offer a abrupie settlement, a promise to provide for the bride, often in the form of property or income that would support her if she were widowed. These weren't casual gestures. They were contracts babon, binding and complex, reviewed by lawyers and patriarchs over tea. Historians still debate whether dowries were empowering or oppressive. Did they give women financial stake in their marriages or reduce them to expensive transactions? Probably both. As with most things, Victorian, it depended heavily on class geography and how sympathetic your father's solicitor was feeling that week. But make no mistake, the economics of marriage were as important as the emotions. Love was lovely, but security, that was essential. No one wanted a daughter married off to a charming poet with no prospects and a suspicious mustache. And here, in this polite flurry of crystal vases and legal documents, you begin to understand the full scope of a Victorian wedding. It wasn't just a romantic celebration. It was a full-blown operation. Poursuite de a strategic union. A statement of identity, intention, and aspiration. Even the gifts carried messages. A silver brush set might whisper, "We believe in your elegance." A new armoire might hint, "We hope this fills up with baby clothes." A chest of linens might shout, "Please don't move back in with us." The bride's mother would supervise the unwrapping, her expression a careful mix of satisfaction and relief. The groom's father would nod approvingly at the heft of the oak armchair or the fine grain of the mahogany washstand. Everyone else would mill about, sipping weak punch and discussing how fortunate the couple was. Meaning, this match came together just in time. And the bride and groom, still side by side, still a little stunned by the weight of it all, but slowly beginning to smile. Because beneath the formalities and the furniture, the tea sets and the toasts, something real is forming, something quiet and tentative and lovely. And as the guests start to gather their coats and the carriages creak back into motion, the couple retreats once again to their carriage, this time not as newlyweds heading toward a feast, but as a married pair embarking on the next stage of their very Victorian journey. The light is softer now. Late afternoon spills lazily across the road as the carriage rocks gently once more beneath the bride and groom. They're quieter than before, tired perhaps, or simply reflective. In the hush between destinations, their first private conversation as husband and wife might finally unfold. Not grand declarations, but something small. A question about comfort. A compliment about the way the veil caught the light. Maybe even a shared laugh, careful and hushed, like two children slipping away from a crowded room. Where are they headed now? Not to a beach resort, not to a secluded cabin or a city of canals. There are no airplane tickets folded neatly in a suitcase, no spa robes waiting, no couples massage booked. They're going on their honeymoon. And if you're imagining passion and palm trees adjust your expectations, the Victorian honeymoon was different. You see, the original honeymoon wasn't meant to be a private romantic getaway. It was a social tour. A carefully scheduled pilgrimage through the homes of relatives, friends, and influential family connections. Think of it less like a second act of romance and more like a traveling open house, with lace gloves. In the earliest years of the Victorian era, honeymoons weren't even especially common. They began gaining popularity only as the middle and upper classes embraced the custom, copying the aristocracy in everything from cake tiers to carriage decor. At first, it was all about appearances, showing the bride off, reinforcing the new alliance, receiving blessings, and small gifts from those unable to attend the wedding itself. So instead of sipping champagne in a mountain chalet, our couple might be knocking politely on the door of the groom's aunt in Surrey. There they'd be offered tea and sponge cake, endure a few stiff hugs, and sit awkwardly on floral sofas while the family dog sniffed around the train of the bride's dress. If they were lucky, they'd stay the night. If not, back in the carriage they'd go. And so it went, from cousin to cousin, manor to manor, like newlywed ambassadors on a goodwill mission. Their luggage would be modest but meaningful, perhaps bearing initials in brass or ribbon. The bride might carry a small traveling fan embroidered with her new monogram, and a gift in hand, a lace-trimmed handkerchief for the hostess, or a small painted dish. These weren't just tokens. They were demonstrations of grace, of polite gratitude, and of the bride's domestic readiness. Historians still debate whether these social call honeymoons were a charming custom or a soul-crushing series of forced visits dressed up as celebration. Probably both. For the shy bride or anxious groom, it must have felt a little like being examined under a doily-covered microscope, especially when you remember that these couples often hadn't spent any real alone time together before marriage. Courtship in the Victorian age was a heavily supervised affair. Every stroll through the garden had a chaperone lurking 10 steps behind. Every conversation was public, every glance monitored. Privacy was not just frowned upon, it was socially explosive. A single unchaperoned moment could tarnish a woman's reputation beyond repair. And reputation for a Victorian woman was everything. In fact, the rules of courtship read like the world's most anxiety-inducing instruction manual. A young woman could not call on a gentleman. He had to express interest first, preferably through intermediaries. If he visited, it had to be during the proper hours, usually in the late morning or mid-afternoon, and always in the presence of a chaperone, often her mother and aunt, or a long-suffering governess who pretended to be engrossed in her embroidery while secretly recording every syllable. There were acceptable topics of conversation, music, whether the Queen's latest dress, and there were not so acceptable ones, money, politics, or heaven forbid anything bodily. A misplaced compliment could end a courtship. A glance that lingered too long could spark a scandal. And flirtation, that was best reserved for marriage, preferably years into it. Even letters were monitored. If a gentleman wrote to a young woman, that letter was often read by her parents or guardians before she saw it. The tone had to be formal, flowery if possible. If it was romantic, it had better include at least one reference to eternal devotion and at least 2 classical metaphors, preferably something involving swans or ancient poets. You might think that sounds exhausting. You'd be correct. So by the time a couple was finally married and whisked away into their honeymoon carriage, they were practically strangers, officially sanctioned. Strangers who were expected to build a life together, starting with polite conversation over cold ham in various relatives' dining rooms. Of course not. Every honeymoon was spent visiting extended family. As the 19th century wore on and rail travel became more accessible, some couples did venture further afield. Popular destinations included the English Lake District Bath, the Scottish Highlands, or even if the family was well off and daring the European continent. France, Italy, and Switzerland were favorite spots, offering picturesque views and foreign food, just exotic enough to feel thrilling without being truly dangerous. Still, even these trips weren't always private. It wasn't unheard of for a newlywed couple to travel with a companion, especially if the bride was very young or of very high birth. A lady's maid might accompany the bride to ensure modesty and propriety were maintained. Nothing says romance like your third wheel unpacking your nightgown. And yes, that nightgown, part of the bridal trousseau. The trousseau was the bride's personal cache of clothing linens and household items, often collected over years and lovingly packed into a series of trunks. It might include nightgowns, day dresses, undergarments, embroidered hand towels, tablecloths, and bed linens, many stitched by the bride herself or gifted by relatives. In wealthier households, the trousseau could fill an entire room. In modest ones, it might be a single trunk with monogrammed pillowcases and hopes tucked between the folds. A trousseau wasn't just practical. It was symbolic. It declared, I am ready to run a household. I am prepared to be a wife. Look at my needlework. Admire my inventory of linens. I am not just a girl in a veil. I am a manager of domestic empire. In this way, the trousseau joined the wedding cake, the veil, the dowry, and the endless etiquette rules in forming a portrait of ideal Victorian womanhood. Silent, resourceful, modest, and entirely prepared both in linen and in virtue. But back to the honeymoon carriage. The ride is longer now, as the couple leaves the bustle of the reception behind. Outside the window, trees blur past in a green haze. The groom removes his gloves. The bride adjusts her bonnet. Their knees might touch accidentally, of course, or perhaps not so accidentally. And perhaps, as the sun begins to dip and the first shadows of evening slide across the road, they finally smile at each other. Not the polite, measured smiles of the wedding morning, but something warmer, something real. After all, for all the stiff rules and suffocating layers, the Victorian wedding wasn't without its sweetness. Beneath the starch and ceremony, there was hope. Real, earnest hope that love could grow, that companionship could blossom, that a lifetime might unfold between two people who had until very recently never spent more than 10 minutes alone. Historians still argue whether this expectation that affection would follow duty was optimistic or cruel. Did it trap people in mismatched marriages? Or did it foster a quieter, sturdier kind of love? The carriage bumps gently over a cobbled lane. The horses snort and toss their heads. And the bride leans just slightly toward her new husband, her hand resting briefly on the velvet seat between them. No one's watching now. The chaperones are gone. The gifts are delivered. The cake is cut. The vows are sealed. And somewhere on the road ahead, beyond the roses pressed into her handkerchief and the layers of lace folded into her suitcase, something truly private begins. Something only the two of them will remember. The carriage slows to a gentle stop. Outside the window, a modest country estate stretches across a manicured lawn, its chimneys puffing a welcome trail of smoke into the cool evening sky. A housemaid in a pressed apron hurries forward to greet the couple, cheeks flushed from excitement or exertion, or possibly from trying to iron 100 napkins before they arrived. The groom helps the bride down carefully, their movements still stiff with formality, but now touched with something else, growing familiarity, a sense of rhythm, a shared quiet. They've arrived at their first stop on the honeymoon tour, a visit to the groom's great-aunt Millicent. Or perhaps a second cousin once removed whose invitation came with an underlined note. We'll be expecting you Monday afternoon. Because even when celebrating what was supposed to be their most personal private moment, a Victorian couple was rarely allowed to be alone for long. Inside, the sitting room is filled with the scent of lavender and parlor dust. Tea has been laid out weak, as was the fashion, and cucumber sandwiches rest beneath a lace cloth so fine it might dissolve under too intense a stare. The bride is seated gently, given a moment to compose herself, then invited to say a few words to the elderly relatives, gathered like statues around her. And you thought your in-laws asking about grandchildren over dinner was pressure. This scene is repeated over and over again during the traditional Victorian honeymoon. A parade of formal visits, polite introductions, and careful observations. The bride, especially, is on display not in a malicious way, but in the deeply ingrained societal way. Everyone wants to see how she carries herself. Is she gracious? Is she refined? Is her accent just right? Did she curtsy too deeply or not quite enough? You begin to understand why so many of these young women practiced their comportment for years leading up to marriage. The stakes weren't just reputational, They were survivalist. A successful honeymoon visit could cement the bride's place in the wider family. A misstep, a misquoted poem, a crooked hem, a forgotten thank you could send ripples through the family grapevine faster than gossip over a dry scone. And so between sips of tea and awkward pauses in the drawing room, a new kind of intimacy begins to grow between the bride and groom. The bond of endurance. They sit side by side during dinners where no one speaks above a whisper. They share glances during long conversations about local vicarage renovations. They endure impromptu poetry readings from lonely relatives and accept unsolicited advice about marital bliss from widowed great-uncles. Through it all, they begin to communicate in glances, subtle nods, the shared language of two people navigating a maze of lace curtains and polite expectations. Outside of these visits, there are rare moments of privacy, often dictated by architecture. A walk in the garden, a seat beside each other on a stone bench where a wisteria-covered pergola offers 10 stolen minutes of silence. These were the real treasures of the Victorian honeymoon. The in-between spaces. The stolen quiet. The opportunity to talk, truly talk, for the first time without a chaperone looming like a hawk in crinoline. And talk they did. Often awkwardly at first. Imagine trying to build emotional intimacy while staying inside the strict framework of your upbringing. She may be unsure what topics are acceptable. He may feel pressure to appear capable, but not overbearing. They may default to discussing books, mutual acquaintances, or the weather. Always the weather. But eventually, sometimes gradually, sometimes with surprising ease, the walls begin to lower. The carriage rides become more relaxed. The shared dinners less performative. They begin to speak with candor tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. They learn each other's rhythms, preferences, silences. They become partners in the game of navigating Victorian society, teammates in the ongoing sport of endurance politeness. And finally, one day, the visits end. The carriage rolls one last time, this time towards their new home. For many couples, this would be their first experience living together in any meaningful way. Their new household, whether a cottage townhouse or a set of rooms above a shop, was a blank canvas. Not in a modern bohemian, let's hang fairy lights kind of way, but rather in the deeply traditional sense of how will we uphold the expectations placed upon us by generations of ancestors who are probably still watching from oil paintings. They'd enter this space perhaps a little wide-eyed. The furniture might be new, purchased with a portion of the dowry, or inherited, smelling faintly of mothballs and family obligation. The kitchen, if the bride intended to cook, would become her domain, or more likely she would direct servants in how to keep it running, according to her standards. The drawing room would be hers to decorate, stocked with gifted doilies and wedding presents too delicate to ever use. And on the second floor, yes, there was the bedroom. This room, more than any other, was cloaked in quiet expectation. No one would speak of it openly. There were no guides, no pamphlets, no instructional scrolls. The bride was expected to understand her duties, a euphemism passed from mother to daughter with blushing cheeks and vague metaphors about roses, bees, and the sanctity of marriage. The truth is, for many Victorian women, their wedding night was their first true moment of personal vulnerability. The first time they would be fully seen, unprotected, unchaperoned, unstructured. And for the groom, the same. There may have been nerves, tension, a shared sense of anticipation tinged with fear. They were about to cross a boundary that until now had been strictly reinforced by every parent-teacher sermon and social cue they had ever known. But within that silence lay something powerful, a turning point. Historians still debate whether Victorian couples, after all the restriction and ritual, experienced a deeper kind of intimacy over time, precisely because they had to grow into it together without pretense or practice. Modern thinkers often assume such repression must have stunted emotional bonds, but there is also a theory, quiet, romantic, perhaps naive, that delayed closeness created a more profound and mutual understanding. A love built on the foundation of gentle discovery, of trust, the bloom from the careful lifting of each veil, both literal and metaphorical. But even intimacy was just one piece of the new life ahead, because being a Victorian wife or husband came with a to-do list that no one ever wrote down, yet everyone knew by heart. The bride was now a household manager. She would oversee meals, budgets, hiring and firing of staff if they had any, and the maintenance of social connections. She would write the thank you notes, plan the dinners, remember the birthdays, and embroider the handkerchiefs. She would become the emotional heart of the home scene, but never dramatic, present, but never imposing. The groom. He became the provider, the protector, the public face. His work would define their financial reality. His status would affect their invitations. His behavior would reflect not only on him, but on his wife, his children, his entire legacy. Marriage was not just a bond of affection. It was a mutual enterprise. A partnership with clearly defined roles and expectations. And yet in the quiet of their shared home, in the early mornings before the maid arrived or in the lamplight hours after the supper dishes were cleared, the couple might begin to find something that wasn't in the books. Something warm, something sleepy and soft, something that looked suspiciously like love. And perhaps it began not with declarations or poetry, but with something simple. "Shall I pour your tea? Did you sleep well? I moved the flowers to the other window. I think they get more light there." These tiny exchanges, meaningless to anyone else, began to weave a kind of intimacy deeper than lace and louder than any wedding march. Because while the Victorian wedding was all ritual and spectacle, a Victorian marriage was built in these quiet hours, in shared breakfasts, in overlapping footsteps, in hands brushing while folding linens. And as the household settled into its new rhythm, so did the couple, no longer bride and groom, but partners, co-conspirators in the slow, deliberate dance of Victorian domesticity. Morning comes softly, the pale light of a cloudy English sky filtering through embroidered curtains as the couple awakens in their new home. The house is still. No bells ring, no guests murmur behind paper-thin parlor doors. The bustle of the wedding, the clinking of forks, the drone of toast, it has all faded, leaving only the quiet hum of ordinary life, or at least what will become ordinary once they figure out where the sugar is kept. She sits by the window, her nightdress modest but new, her hair brushed and pinned loosely. He stands nearby, buttoning his collar with practiced fingers, one eye on the mirror, and the other on the reflection of a woman he now calls wife. They exchange a glance, something wordless but warm. The rituals are over, the performance complete. Now comes the part no one scripted. But before the rhythm of married life can fully take hold, there is one last hurdle to clear: the return to society. In the Victorian world, marriage wasn't complete until it had been witnessed, confirmed, and socially absorbed by one's community, and that meant re-entering public life as a couple. The visits continued, not the honeymoon obligations, but the local ones. Neighbors would call, distant acquaintances would send cards. The couple would be expected to attend dinners, recitals, charity events. And always, always the scrutiny continued. The bride was no longer simply herself. She was now Mrs. So-and-so, with the so-and-so part looming much larger than the Mrs. She was expected to dress according to her station host with grace, speak with just enough wit to charm, but never enough to overshadow. And heaven help her if she used the wrong silver tongs at tea. The groom faced a different set of pressures. He had to demonstrate that he was providing not just financially, but morally, socially, and spiritually. His reputation now cast a long shadow, one that touched not only his household, but his wife, and one day perhaps his children. In the eyes of Victorian society, marriage was both culmination and commencement. The wedding was the gateway, but what lay beyond was where true virtue or failure was measured. And yes, with this return came another curious tradition, the writing and a distribution of wedding announcements. Published in local newspapers or sent via engraved cards on thick creamy stock, these notices served both a practical and symbolic function. They announced the union to those not in attendance, but more than that, they confirmed the social order. They said, yes, this match was approved, this bond was sealed, this household now exists within the proper boundaries of tradition and expectation. Historians still debate whether these announcements were truly for communication or for quiet self-congratulation. A way to show that one's daughter had married well, that one's son had chosen wisely, that the wheels of polite society turned as expected, no squeaks or slips in decorum. And as the couple eased into married life, the trappings of their union slowly settled around them. Take, for example, the wedding ring. A small, unassuming gold band on the bride's hand, simple and smooth without diamonds or inscriptions visible to the world. The symbolism was clear, unbroken, eternal, without embellishment. Yet more often than not, hidden on the inside of the band was an engraving. A set of initials, a date, perhaps a private word or phrase known only to the couple. These hidden messages were among the few truly intimate gestures in the otherwise public theatre of Victorian marriage. A whisper of affection etched into metal, a promise that no one else needed to see to know was there. Interestingly, the groom didn't usually wear a ring. The custom of men wearing wedding bands didn't take hold widely until the 20th century, particularly after the World Wars. In the Victorian age, a man's word and perhaps the lease agreement on his home was proof enough of his commitment. And yet, for all its formality, Victorian marriage contained unexpected tenderness. There were shared routines, quiet walks, joint readings of the newspaper evenings by the fire. There were gifts, pressed flowers between the pages of a book, a ribbon kept from the wedding bouquet, a locket with a miniature portrait. Husbands might surprise their wives with mourning jewelry. Yes, even in life, small items crafted with strands of hair, often braided and worn in a pendant or brooch, meant to symbolize enduring love that transcended even death. That might sound macabre now, but in an era where death was ever present, where a fever or childbirth or bad milk could end a life in days, to love someone so deeply that you already mourned them was considered romantic. And beyond these physical tokens was the social work of marriage, establishing traditions, negotiating boundaries, managing friendships. Couples were expected to visit the less fortunate, contribute to charity, attend church. The wife might organize a local fundraiser. The husband might sit on a board or committee. These weren't just pastimes, they were proofs of a well-ordered union. The couple that gave together it was believed stayed together. But still, the expectations didn't stop. There was pressure to conceive. Of course, quietly and without complaint. A child was seen as the natural next step, the continuation of the family line. Every glance at the bride's midsection, every offhand remark from an older relative about nurseries and night feeds was a loaded whisper of what came next. Yet, not all couples conceived easily, and when they didn't, the silence around the subject became even louder. Imagine being a young Victorian bride months or years into marriage fielding increasingly pointed inquiries about your health or your glow. There were no fertility clinics, no helpful acronyms like TTC. There was just quiet speculation and sometimes subtle blame. Historians still argue whether childlessness in Victorian marriages was met with true sympathy or masked contempt. What's certain is that for many couples it added another layer of quiet grief beneath the already thick fabric of social duty. And then of course came the anniversaries arc, not celebrated with balloons or restaurant reservations but marked by tradition. A gift of paper for the first year, cotton for the second, leather for the third. Some of these customs emerged later, solidified by etiquette books and department store catalogs. But even in the early years, tokens were exchanged, often humble, always meaningful. A handwritten letter, a stitched handkerchief, a new Bible with a pressed violet tucked inside. By now, the couple had developed a rhythm. Their silences no longer awkward, but companionable. Their glances filled not with uncertainty, but understanding. They had learned the cadence of their days, the unspoken agreements about who rises first, who forgets their gloves, who always overbutters the toast. This was marriage. Not the pomp, not the organ music, not the towering cake, but the soft, slow practice of knowing another person thoroughly and still choosing to share the same roof, the same routines, the same life. And perhaps, just perhaps, they even looked back fondly on the wedding day itself. "Remember the chimney sweep," the groom might say with a chuckle, and the bride, smiling faintly, might reply, "He kissed me on the cheek." I think that's why everything went so well, because in the end, even the most structured, restricted rituals couldn't contain the quiet swell of something deeper, something persistent, something as old as vows and as new as every whispered good night. And when guests visited, when neighbors asked after them, when someone clucked over the wife's stitching or admired the husband's diligence, they smiled with the knowing of two people who had made it through the pageantry and into the part that mattered most. The living of the thing. There is a rhythm now. Not the artificial cadence of the wedding march or the clink of cutlery during the breakfast feast, but the slow, real rhythm of daily life. Booze by the door. Tea at 8. A pause before the post arrives. The couple once stiff and ceremonial has softened at the edges. The wife hums sometimes while folding napkins. The husband forgets his gloves but remembers her preferred brand of lemon soap. And as their life takes root in this rhythm, the world around them continues to judge quietly, politely, constantly. One of the most enduring markers of Victorian respectability, especially for newlyweds, was the ability to host a proper dinner, Krika. Not just a casual meal, there was no such thing, but a performance of social precision, hospitality, and understated wealth. So picture this, the table is set. Candles burn low in polished holders. A fresh damask tablecloth covers the table like a snowdrift. The silver gleams. The servants move silently. And every detail, from the seating chart to the shape of the napkin folds, has been curated to say one thing. We belong here. To dine in a Victorian household wasn't just to eat, it was to participate in a ritual of status. Guests would arrive, promptly remove their gloves, and be escorted into the drawing room for sherry. There they'd make polite conversation. No gossip, no politics, no overly personal questions. Just a soft hum of mutual observation. Then as the clock chimed a dignified note, the party would process to the dining room. The menu elaborate. Always. Think roasted haunch of venison pigeon pie oysters on ice-baked sole in cream sauce potatoes, au gratin and syllabub for dessert. And all of it, every mouthful presented in courses, each with its own plate utensils and proper garnishes. And at the center of it all, always the wedding china. Those carefully selected plates and cups given as gifts or inherited from an aunt with dubious taste became the scaffolding of social legitimacy. The correct dinner service could elevate the simplest meal. The wrong one could raise eyebrows. It might sound petty now, but to a Victorian household these things mattered. Every polished fork was a whisper of refinement. Every matched wineglass a quiet declaration. We understand the rules. Historians still debate whether these rules were a genuine expression of civilization or merely a social maze designed to exclude those who hadn't memorized it. But either way, the newlyweds had to learn the script and fast. The wife especially was expected to shine. Not dominate, the conversation heavens know, but steer it gently like a rudder made of cambric and charm. She must know who to seat next, to whom, what topics to deflect, how to gently change the subject when someone mentioned trade unions or childbirth. She must be gracious and warm but not overly familiar, elegant but not showy, witty but not irreverent. It was a performance that required stamina, poise, and about a gallon of chamomile tea afterwards. And when the guests finally left, carriages rumbling into the darkness and bonnets adjusted in hallway mirrors, the couple could finally exhale. Shoes kicked off, corset loosened, cravat unknotted, the candlelight now flickering lazily rather than assertively. These were the moments when marriage stopped being performance and started being presence. Perhaps they'd sit on the edge of the bed and laugh about the guest who called the soup a bit forward, or sigh in relief that the roast didn't dry out, or just sit in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that says, "We did it. we survived another round of judgment. And when morning came again, the routine resumed. Letters to be written, errands to run. The business of daily Victorian life churning forward like a clock powered by lace and obligation. But now amidst all this, something new begins to emerge, the subtle marks of shared memory. They begin to collect keepsakes, not grand ones, not silver or portraits, but small private things. A broken fan from a windy evening, a ribbon from a bouquet that arrived unexpectedly, a list of dinner guests scrawled on the back of a discarded envelope, and tucked away in a drawer somewhere perhaps the most precious item of all, an impressed flower from her wedding bouquet, brittle now but still sweet-smelling, still edged in the scent of that first sacred day. The Victorians adored hakibri, keepsakes, often more than the actual events they commemorated. Memory for them was a tactile experience, something you could hold, preserve, mourn, celebrate. They kept scrapbooks filled with locks of hair, snippets of fabric, dried flowers, invitations, and handwritten notes. A bride might keep a temple, memory box and door filled with tokens of courtship and early marriage, a glove with worn stitching, a small photo with the corner curled, the first note he ever wrote, her still folded neatly, smelling faintly of violets and ink. And these weren't just sentimental gestures. They were insurance policies against time. A way to hold on to love, to freeze it in amber before the years rushed in with their babies and sorrows and routine. Because despite the rituals, despite the etiquette, Victorian couples knew just as we do that time would soften everything. The lace would yellow, the photographs would fade. The names on the back of place cards would one day be hard to recall. But that ribbon, that lock of hair that scrawled a note about an inside joke no one else would understand, that would survive. And as the years passed, anniversaries would come and go, marked with gifts made of paper, wood, and eventually tin. The couple might sit in the drawing room, her embroidery forgotten in her lap, his book closed on the side table, and they'd talk about the early days. "Do you remember," she might ask, "when the chimney sweep kissed me and you looked like you were about to challenge him to a duel?" He'd chuckle, "I still might." Or, "Remember the cake? How we had to cut it twice because your cousin sneezed on the first slice." "That was your cousin." "No, my cousin only fainted." The laughter would be quiet, a low ripple in the lamplight. These were the golden returns moments when the present folded gently back into the past, not with regret, but with affectionate reverence. A mutual recognition that what had once been ceremony had become something much rarer, shared history. And perhaps in those later years when the children had grown and the world had begun to change, when corsets loosened and carriages gave way to tramcars, they would look back on that early harrowing formal day of their wedding, not with exasperation, but with a tender sort of awe. Because amidst the petals and propriety, the lace and legality, something had truly begun. Not just a marriage, but a memory. And it was still blooming. Time in the Victorian household was not just measured in hours and minutes, it was measured in seasons of tradition. Every element of the home, every tick of the grandfather clock, every ruffle of the parlor curtains told a story of consistency, propriety, and continuity. Marriage, especially in those early years, was woven tightly into this structure, but like any tightly woven fabric strain, could build along the seams. As we move deeper into the marriage of our once newlywed couple, a subtle shift begins to take place. They know each other now, not just the curve of a smile or the preferred jam on toast, but the deeper patterns, the things unsaid, the weight of expectation, the relief of silence. Yet amid this domestic stability comes a new and pressing theme: how others see them. You see, the Victorian world revolved around reputation, especially for women, especially for married women. A lady's name, her honor, her virtue, her behavior in society was a form of currency, and once spent, it could not be regained. She must never be alone with a man not her husband. She must dress appropriately, modestly, attractively, but never provocatively. She must write letters that were warm, but never too emotional, speak at gatherings without dominating, and walk through town with her head neither too high nor too low. It was a tightrope of expectation, and there was no net below. If gossip began to swirl about her friendships, her lack of children, her presence at the wrong kind of gathering, it could spell social ruin. Invitations would dry up. Eyes would turn away. Her husband's business might even suffer. In this world, a woman's actions were never just her own. They rippled outward, touching everything from her children's prospects to the way the grocer said good morning. Meanwhile, the husband faced a different kind of scrutiny, less about purity, more about duty. Was he working hard enough? Providing well, managing the home with dignity? Did he vote responsibly, give to charity, attend church, speak well of his wife? A man who drank too much or gambled or flirted too openly could disgrace his family. A man who worked too little or dressed too flamboyantly might be dismissed as unreliable. Even small choices, a poorly timed joke, an unorthodox opinion could raise eyebrows. Historians still debate whether this level of social surveillance was intended to protect or to control, but its effects were real. For many couples, married life was not just about intimacy and companionship, it was a public project, performed daily. And it wasn't just the humans being scrutinized. Let's talk for a moment about the home itself, which in Victorian marriage became an extension of the couple's identity. For the wife, the household was her stage. Every room was a reflection of her taste, her diligence, her skill. A tidy parlor meant a disciplined mind. A well-stocked pantry meant foresight. The presence of fresh flowers ideally arranged with symbolic meaning suggested an elegant domestic spirit. Guests, of course, noticed everything. The quality of the table linens, the shine on the doorknobs, the dustlessness of the piano. And let's not forget the mantelpiece. That sacred little theater of domestic pride where one might display family photographs, heirloom clocks, or if the marriage was recent, wedding favors preserved in glass. But the greatest source of pride in the household, and often the most whispered about, was the presence of children. Yes, we've mentioned this before, but here as time ticks onward, the pressure mounts. The first year, everyone smiles patiently. The second, polite questions. The third, raised eyebrows. The fourth, suggestions whispered into the bride's ear at dinner parties, offered gently and with a sympathetic squeeze of the hand. If no child arrived, the speculation grew. Was there an issue? Was the bride unwell? Was the groom disinterested, or worse, was something improper afoot? In reality, infertility was common and poorly understood. Medical explanations were limited and the stigma was profound. Couples often suffered in silence, placing blame upon themselves or each other, unsure whether to seek help, if help even existed. Superstitions flourished. Tonic makers thrived. Desperation wore lace gloves. And for those who did have children, another performance began. The nursery had to be properly appointed. The governess, if one could be afforded, needed impeccable references. The children's clothing should be spotless, their speech delicate, their behavior just shy of angelic. Even play was scheduled, structured, intentional. The Victorian home was in every sense a miniature kingdom, and its rulers were expected to reign with elegance and efficiency. But what of love? Where had it gone? The couple still found each other often in the quietest hours. After the guests had left the candles snuffed and the window shuttered, they'd find themselves sitting beside one another, each reading silently occasionally, pausing to share a paragraph or remember joke from their courtship days. Sometimes the wife would write letters while the husband played chess against himself. Sometimes they'd walk in the garden together, commenting on the roses or the weather or the way the neighbor's dog barked at nothing. These moments weren't grand, they weren't passionate, but they were real, steady, enduring. And every so often a letter would arrive. A friend from the wedding, a cousin who'd attended the feast, a note with a ribbon. Do you remember when the veil caught fire and the best man stomped it out with his good shoes? Laughter would return, and so would memory. And perhaps as a reward for surviving all these expectations, our couple might celebrate a milestone. A wedding anniversary. The 5th year, the 10th, the 20th. No big party. Just a quiet supper. A shared glass of port. A book of poetry brought out and dusted off. The same vows spoken not aloud, but through presence. I am still here. I am still yours. We made it through the performance. Now we live the encore. And if they were especially sentimental, and many Victorians were, they might look again at their wedding photograph. That sepia-toned portrait still framed, still heavy. She in her stiff dress, eyes unreadable. He beside her back, straight face, serious. They'd chuckle. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they'd just sit quietly holding hands, fingers laced in the way they weren't allowed to for that first portrait. That image had been made for society. This evening, this silence, this comfort was made for them. It's strange, isn't it? That a marriage born in stiffness and ceremony amid guests and obligations could grow into something so private, so unspoken, so deeply alive. But perhaps that was always the secret. Not the lace or the cake or the vows etched in gold, but the small things that came after. The everyday glances, the routines, the quiet mercy of being known. And so the years unfold like pages in a diary no one dares read aloud. The couple, once two figures locked in ceremonial posture for a wedding portrait, have softened with time. Their footsteps echo together across hallways that once felt new. They no longer ask if the other prefers cream or lemon in their tea. They already know. They just pour it silently, lovingly, with a practiced hand. Yet amidst this domestic harmony, a new season begins, one often accompanied by sleepless nights, rattling cribs, and lullabies hummed in half-remembered tune. Yes, the baby arrives. For Victorian couples, the birth of a child was more than a milestone. It was an affirmation, a punctuation mark on the sentence that had begun with a wedding invitation. Children, particularly sons, were viewed as tangible evidence that the union was both virtuous and fertile, approved not just by family but by God himself. The pro-to-birth announcement would be discreet but formal. Perhaps a card sent through the post with the tasteful script, Mr. and Mrs. Charles W. Ellingsworth are pleased to announce the birth of a son, Edward Thomas, on the morning of the 17th of May. The note might be sealed with wax, or delicately perfumed. If one was particularly traditional, a lock of baby hair would be tucked inside. From there, the machine of Victorian child-rearing etiquette kicked into gear. The child's wardrobe was immediately a reflection of the parents' refinement. Tiny lace bonnets, booties knit by a distant aunt. Christening gowns passed down through 3 generations made of fabric so fine it could disintegrate in a strong breeze. The christening itself was another public ritual usually held within a month of the baby's birth. The ceremony performed at the family's parish church was steeped in Anglican tradition and deeply symbolic. It wasn't merely about naming the child. It was about placing the child into the social and spiritual fabric of the community. Godparents would be chosen strategically. A well-connected uncle, a wealthy cousin, a friend from school who now sat on the board of something important. Godparenting in Victorian terms was as much about networking as it was about guidance. A spiritual guardian, yes, but also a figure who could lend the child opportunities, favors, and well-placed recommendations down the line. Following the ceremony, guests would gather for a light luncheon. Or if the family was truly fashionable, an elaborate tea. Gifts would be presented, silver rattles, teething rings, perhaps a book of moral poetry. Someone would inevitably quote scripture. Someone else would whisper about how thin the mother looked and whether she was too thin, and whether the nursemaid had actually attended to the child that morning, because the mother's role was now firmly defined. Her purpose had expanded or, depending on your view, narrowed. She was no longer simply a wife. She was now the moral cornerstone of the home. She was expected to guide the children's education, especially in matters of virtue, manners, and emotional restraint. She might not change every nappy or spoon every broth, that's what nursemaids were for, but she was responsible for the child's character, their soul, the child's first words credited to her. Their tantrums also her fault. Historians still debate whether this intense maternal ideal was genuinely empowering or just another gilded cage. Some women embraced it, others found it suffocating, but all were measured by it. Meanwhile, the father's role, though more publicly visible, was arguably just as rigid. He was the boor, provider bukr, yes, but also the disciplinarian, the hand of order. He must strike the balance between warmth and restraint, between affectionate play and austere correction. Too stern, and he was cold. Too gentle, and he risked losing the household's respect. He was also, crucially, the architect of legacy. A boy must be educated, groomed, prepared for responsibility. A girl must be taught refinement poise and how to make an advantageous match. The father's decisions about tutors, about allowances, about marriage arrangements would echo into the next generation. A single miscalculation and the family's entire trajectory could shift. The pressure was immense, quiet but relentless. And yet somehow, amidst the high expectations and sleepless nights, these small new beings brought something the lace and linen could never achieve. Unstructured joy. The first laugh. The first awkward toddle across the drawing room rug. The first time the child pointed at a portrait on the wall and called it Papa in a way that made everyone melt. In these moments, even the stiffest Victorian heart cracked open a bit. And the home itself responded. The parlor, once a place of pristine performance, now had a toy tucked beneath the settee. The rose garden saw its share of mud pies. The dog was now sometimes fed bits of biscuit from under the breakfast table. Not by the children, of course. Never, certainly not. And in the nursery, tucked beneath heavy drapes and surrounded by rocking horses, alphabet blocks, and linen bibs, the new mother sometimes found her only solitude. She might sit in the rocker with a child against her chest, humming the hymn from her wedding ceremony. Or she might simply stare into the flickering firelight, one hand resting on her child's back, the other holding the edge of a half-finished cross-stitch sampler that would likely remain unfinished forever. Because the time had shifted again, marriage had become parenthood. Vows had given way to lullabies. And while society still watched, still judged, the inner world of the couple was now defined not by spectacle, but by survival, comfort, and co-parenting. Of course, not every marriage weathered these years smoothly. Victorian society did not often speak openly of marital strife, but it existed quietly behind drawn curtains and perfectly trimmed hedges. A husband could grow distant, a wife could grow weary. Affairs happened, silence thickened. Some couples became polite strangers. But others grew stronger. Historians still puzzle over the deep affection found in letters exchanged between long-married Victorian couples, the tenderness in the phrasing, the inside jokes, the whispered poetry of daily routine. For all their rules and restraint, many Victorians believed deeply in the idea of companionate marriage. A union not just of bodies, but of minds and souls. It wasn't about passion, it was about partnership, steadfast, enduring, quietly luminous. And through it all, the symbols of their union remained. The ring, the photograph, the wedding dress stored carefully in a cedar chest, occasionally lifted out and touched, then folded again like a memory you don't dare say out loud. There were rumors that one day the eldest daughter might wear that dress, or have the lace remade into a bonnet, or carry the same bouquet, or walk down the same church aisle beneath the same trailing ivy. Because in the Victorian world, Exeter, marriage was legacy. Each union formed a thread in the great tapestry of a family honor and history, and when the couple, now older, sat together in the evening, watching their grandchildren chase each other across the rug, they understood something their younger selves never could. That the wedding was just the first note, but the melody, the long, winding, deeply imperfect melody of marriage, was the music that stayed, and still played even after the bells had long since fallen silent. Years pass. The house grows quieter. The nursery that once echoed with baby laughter now holds only furniture too precious to be used and too sentimental to be given away. Dust settles in the corners where toy blocks once hid, and little feet once pitter-pattered across polished wood. The children, now grown, are off building lives of their own. Some are already married. Some are still being gently nudged in the direction of suitable matches by watchful mothers and godmothers armed with opera tickets and strategically timed garden parties. And now, in this new season of life, the couple finds themselves back where they began, just the two of them. But things are different now. There's a comfortable silence between them, a silence not of awkwardness, but of deep knowing. They've weathered sickness births, business downturns, the death of parents, and the quiet unraveling of society's expectations that once pressed down on them like lead. The parlor has become a place for reading rather than receiving. The husband smokes a pipe now, which he did not do in his younger years. The wife embroiders less and gazes more. She knows the pattern of his cough, the rhythm of his pacing. He knows the way her eyebrows arch when she disagrees but won't say it aloud. They no longer entertain as often, but when they do, there is a shift in tone. They are now the elders, the ones to whom others look for signs of tradition. They host with practiced elegance their movements choreographed by decades of shared events. He carves the roast. She pours the wine. Their glances meet across the table, not in giddy flirtation, but in gentle assurance. And yet even in this peaceful chapter, Victorian decorum demands one final test: death preparedness. You heard me. Because to be truly respectable in the Victorian era meant preparing for your own demise with the same attention to detail you once gave your wedding vows. Memento mori was not just a fashion trend, it was a worldview, and married couples often faced the end of their lives together with the same formal restraint that had marked the beginning. That's not to say love was absent, quite the opposite, it was simply cloaked in ritual. Take, for example, the rise of mourning jewelry. Once only worn by widows or those in deep grief, it gradually became a quiet romantic gesture. A lock of the spouse's hair woven into a brooch. A ring engraved with a wedding date, then worn daily as a quiet testament to enduring love. Some couples even commissioned mourning portraits in advance. As if to say, when I go, this is how I wish to be remembered beside you in my finest dress, with the expression you know best. A photograph might be taken of the couple in their older years seated in the garden or on the settee, surrounded by grandchildren. The man's coat slightly too loose now, the woman's hands delicately wrinkled but still graceful. These photos would then be copied, framed, and sometimes passed down like sacred relics. A final wedding portrait in a way. Not youthful, but true. And when illness came, as it inevitably did, there was no panic, no tears in public, only the ritual. The black armbands, the drawn curtains, the calling cards with thin black borders, the mourning stationery, the decency of grief. If the husband died first, the wife was expected to enter full mourning. Black dress, black veil, and an entire year of social withdrawal. No parties, no theater, no music. Her grief was not just internal, it was embroidered into every hem, pressed into every fold of bombazine. But within that grief was also permission. Permission to say what she hadn't before, to cherish what had been left unsaid. Letters were often found in drawers, notes scribbled in the margins of books. Words like, my dearest, my constant, my reason for every morning. Victorians weren't expressive with their faces, but they were unflinchingly tender in ink. If the wife died first, the husband, though, spared the rigors of full mourning. Dress was expected to demonstrate profound loss. He might retreat from society for months, cancel business appointments, wear a black cravat, write a poem, and often he'd keep her photograph on his writing desk for the rest of his life. Historians still debate whether Victorian grief rituals offered comfort or merely codified suffering. But one thing is clear, the structure gave shape to chaos, a framework for loss. And for those who had built a life within rituals, the transition to widowhood felt strangely natural, like removing the final pin from a carefully constructed hairstyle. Yet there were also those couples who lived long enough to face old age together, truly together. To watch the world change from horseback to gas lamp to electricity, to see women unlace their corsets, to hear the rustle of newspapers filled with wars and trains and suffragettes and factories. They lived long enough to become curiosities in their own right. Imagine them sitting on a bench at the edge of the park. The husband in a worn top hat. the wife wrapped in a shawl that had once been her wedding gift. Children rush past. A gramophone plays somewhere in the distance, and they sit there quietly as they always have, watching it all unfold. Perhaps they speak of the early days, the awkward carriage rides, the chimney sweep, the cake that refused to cut cleanly, the bouquet that wilted too soon. And perhaps they do not. Perhaps they simply hold hands lightly as if to say, we were young once. We stood at that altar. We wore the lace and swallowed the nerves and said the words. We lived the days that followed. All of them. In the final years, the wedding dress may be lifted once more from its cedar box. A granddaughter may try it on, marvel at its weight, laugh at the sleeves, and the old bride watching may smile with something deeper than nostalgia. Because she knows the truth. The wedding was never the point. It was just the spark. What mattered was everything after. Every shared breakfast, every illness nursed, every word whispered at midnight, every disagreement survived, every letter kept, every anniversary remembered with a ribbon, a flower, a smile. And so, as the fire in the hearth burns low and the candlelight flickers softly, the long-married couple prepares for sleep. He closes the book. She folds the shawl. They do not speak. They do not need to. They have said it all before, in vows, in silence, in soup ladles, and letters, and the slow rhythm of a shared life. And as they drift off, one beside the other, the past is not a thing left behind, but a thing they carry with them, tucked like a pressed flower in the pocket of their hearts. The fire crackles gently in the hearth, its golden glow stretching long shadows across the patterned rug. Outside, the world has turned to twilight. A chill presses against the windows. But inside there is warmth, not just from coal and flame, but from something quieter. The kind of warmth that comes from familiarity, from things placed just so, from the slow comfort of a life built over decades. This is the Victorian marriage, not in its beginning, but in its enduring middle. The children are grown, the guests fewer, the laughter softer, but the house still breathes with the memory of its earliest days, the wedding feast, the crisp new linen, the echoes of feet running down the corridor chasing toy hoops. And still through it all, something remarkable remains, the gentle persistence of tradition. You see in Victorian culture, even the smallest domestic moments carried weight. A husband placing his gloves in the same drawer each evening, a wife winding the mantel clock at precisely 8, a tea tray prepared not for need, but out of habit. These acts, mundane as they seem, became rituals of love, a way to say I am here, I remember, I care. Even illness, when it arrived, as it so often did, was met with structure. The sick room was prepared, camphor dabbed on handkerchiefs. Windows opened just enough for air, closed quickly to keep out the fog. The wife would sit bedside reading slowly from scripture or perhaps a well-worn novel, her voice low, rhythmic, soothing. If the husband fell ill, he might pretend he was fine. Men did that even then, but his wife would notice. She would press his forehead, tuck his blanket, adjust the lamp. When roles reversed, he'd move her chair closer to the fire, stir her tea, sit beside her with the patience of a man who had learned how to listen, because by this point in their lives, the couple understood that marriage wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about attentiveness, about knowing when to speak and when to simply be present. A marriage that had begun under the weight of lace and ceremony had become a quiet, steady form of a companionship as language. But let's step back for a moment, because as we near the end of this long journey through the marriage of a Victorian couple, it's worth reflecting on the society that shaped them. Victorian England was, after all, a world in flux. By the late 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed not only the economy, but the family itself. Cities swelled. Trains raced through countryside that once held only sheep and shepherds. Newspapers arrived faster, news travelled further, class lines blurred slightly, though not without resistance. Middle-class families, once modest, now aspired to gentility, and the wedding became a crucial proving ground. For many young brides, the ceremony wasn't just about union, it was about arrival. A way to signal that their family had made it, that they understood the rules of silver placement and lace etiquette, and could host a tea without scandal or chipped porcelain. The rise of department stores meant that brides could now purchase white gowns, not just have them made. Advertisements showed ideal weddings, romanticized spotless with blooming gardens and obedient flower girls. And so the Victorian wedding became less of a community rite and more of a personal showcase. Historians still argue whether this commercialization was a liberation or a trap. Did it allow more women to have the weddings they dreamed of? Or did it create a whole new tier of impossible expectations? And then, of course, came the literature. Oh, the literature. From Bronte to Dickens to Eliot, Victorian authors wrote endlessly about love, marriage, longing, and loss. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester, even Pip and Estella. Their fictional entanglements gave voice to all the feelings polite society could not say aloud. Young women read these novels by lamplight, underlining sentences that felt too true. Young men read them in secret or dismissed them entirely only to quote them by accident years later. Couples quoted them to each other in moments of vulnerability, offering fiction as a safe vessel for real emotion. Love in the Victorian mind was rarely casual. It was solemn, transformative, not just a feeling but a responsibility. And as this ideal seeped into real life, it reshaped the idea of marriage. No longer merely a business arrangement, though it often still was, it became something else, a space where emotion and ethics met, where love was expected to deepen through duty, where passion might flicker, but constancy was the real flame, and that flame once lit was to be tended for life. Now back in our couple's home, the grandchildren arrive on a Sunday visit, shoes thudding on the floorboards, crumbs on the settee, a toy duck dragged by a string down the hallway. The old bride, now grey at the temples but still elegant, watches them with a kind of bemused wonder. The noise, the motion, the barely controlled chaos, it's a reminder that life keeps moving even as the house ages and the clocks tick slower. The groom, now a grandfather with a walking stick, and the faintest shake in his hands helps a small child into a chair too tall for him. He remembers a time when his own children were this small, when he himself was learning how to father, when he watched his wife cradle their firstborn, and felt for the first time what forever really meant. And perhaps in this moment he catches her eye, and she smiles. Not the shy smile of their wedding day. Not the performative smile of hosting or chaperoning or enduring small talk about how many yards of lace were acceptable for sleeve trim, but a true smile. A smile born of shared history, of burnt toast and moonlit dances, of quiet forgiveness and deep enduring respect. And then, as the children gather for a family portrait, an updated tableau of generations, the photographer, now holding something far smaller than the massive camera that captured their own wedding image, lifts his device and calls everyone smile. The children grin wildly. The parents try to compose themselves, but the couple, they simply look at each other, because they know what the smile means. It means we made it. We did the thing. Not just the wedding, but the lifetime that followed. It means I see you, still. It means this is our legacy. And perhaps when the photo is printed, the couple will not be at the center. They might be slightly off to the side, framed by children and grandchildren, dwarfed by newer faces. But their presence will still anchor the entire image, just like they always have. Just like they did on that first day in the church when the bells rang and the air smelled of lilies and myrtle and the veil fluttered slightly in the breeze. It is late now. Not just in the evening, but in life. The house that once buzzed with newness, linen deliveries, flower arrangements, whispered wedding plans, now rests in a kind of twilight stillness. Time has moved differently here. Not in leaps and bounds, but in a slow, rolling tide, polishing every moment smooth. The couple has grown old together. They are no longer the center of every room. They no longer host the grand dinners, the elaborate teas, the carefully choreographed drawing room performances. Their children now do those things in newer homes with brighter lamps and less creaky staircases. But this house, their house, remains familiar and softened with age. The wallpaper has faded, the carpets worn in the paths of old habits, but the air still smells faintly of rosewater, beeswax, and stories. The old wedding photograph still sits on the mantel. Behind its bubbled glass, the sepia tones have yellowed, but the eyes are the same. Her veil a gauzy whisper. His collar too stiff, neither smiling. Both radiant in their own awkward, restrained Victorian way. Visitors who see it for the first time often smile and say, "My, you two were so young." And the wife, seated now in her high-backed chair with a shawl drawn around her shoulders, might nod and say something like, "Yes, I suppose we were," with a tone that means, "You have no idea." Because youth, as the Victorians understood, it was never just about age. It was about innocence. And to be innocent meant not knowing how long and wonderful and difficult marriage really was. How could they have known they thought the vows were the hardest part? The speeches, the walk down the aisle, the weight of a new name. But it turns out those things were easy. The hard part was what came next, the everyday. The scraping of butter onto toast without argument, the folding of handkerchiefs into drawers you no longer open, the shared looks across dinner tables filled with guests who never quite understood the joke you were both laughing at. The children grow. Some move far away, some stay close. The couple becomes the quiet foundation of a family tree that stretches in all directions. They no longer need to advise. Their wisdom is now absorbed by osmosis, in how they sit, in how they listen, in how they are still somehow always together. And when the time comes, because of course it must, one of them will go first. There is no Victorian euphemism that softens the reality of that loss. Death, as they say, is the final ceremony. And yet even here, in the midst of grief, the rituals remain. The mourning brooch, the black ribbon, the envelopes edged in shadow. If it is the wife who remains, she dons the widow's veil, wears it for the proper period, hosts no guests, attends no concerts. Her life becomes quieter, a little dimmer. But her eyes are those eyes, still carry light. She still folds his handkerchiefs, still sets the second cup of tea, still speaks to him when no one's around. And if it is the husband who remains, he sits in the chair she once occupied. He does not rearrange the room. He reads her favorite book aloud to the empty space beside him. He tucks the quilt she made for their first winter together over his knees and waits. Because in Victorian marriage, the bond was never just until death. It was through death. It endured in habits and keepsakes, in faded photographs and pressed petals inside old books, in the smell of the house, in the echo of laughter down long-quieted hallways. And in time he too will pass, and the house will be still once more, until someone, perhaps a grandchild, finds the wedding dress stored carefully in its cedar chest. The lace yellowed the buttons, loose the scent of age clinging to the fabric like memory. They will lift it gently, run their fingers along the seams and wonder, who were they, these people who married in such silence, who lived so long and spoke so little, who never kissed in photographs or danced in the street or posted their love in public for all to see? But if they look closely through the softness of time and the slowness of ritual, they'll see it. They'll see our love not in declarations but in duration, not in fireworks but in kindling, not in passion but in persistence. That was the Victorian way, not loud, not quick, but deep, like roots, like stones warmed by the sun. And perhaps as they return the dress to its box and fasten the clasp, they'll understand. The wedding was never the ending, or even the beginning. It was simply a door, and beyond it stretched a lifetime. And when to part 15, summary below, before... They were not the dreamy, sparkling fairy tales of modern cinema. They were measured, solemn, and steeped in layer upon layer of ritual. From the delicate language of flowers lining the church aisles to the high-necked gowns laced so tightly they left brides breathless. Literally every detail was a symbol, a whisper of purity, fidelity, social status, and control. Courtship was supervised, letters censored, and engagement rings were given with gravity. The ceremony itself was restrained, deeply rooted in religious tradition. Brides and grooms did not smile. They did not kiss at the altar. They did not wave to their friends. Afterward, guests threw rice and blessings. A chimney sweep might appear for luck. And then came the carriage ride, not to a honeymoon as we know it, but often a tour of family homes, building alliances and showing off the bride. Marriage began with structured silence and often limited emotional intimacy. But over time, something soft bloomed beneath the starch and lace. Through daily routine, shared burdens, the raising of children, and the weathering of loss, a quieter kind of love emerged. Victorian weddings were not the pinnacle, they were the prelude. The real romance, often invisible to outsiders, unfolded in teacups poured just right, in the careful folding of linen, in glances exchanged across crowded rooms, in growing old and still choosing to sit side by side. It was not always fair, or easy, or free, but it was at its best enduring. And in the pressed flowers of an old scrapbook, in the yellowing edges of a wedding portrait, you might still hear the soft echo of a vow whispered once long ago. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer.